Welcome to our webinar today. Today I'm joined by Accenture. We'll primarily focus on how do we secure operational technology and Internet of Things with Zero Trust. And I'm joined by Justin Vieira. By the way of introduction, I run OT security here at Zscaler. I'm responsible for the go-to-market on the product side of the house. For that, I'll hand off Justin to introduce himself and talk through what he's leading at Accenture.
Thanks, Deepak. Hey, everybody. My name is Justin Vieira. I'm a Houston-based member of Accenture's OT security practice. So I wanted to talk a little bit about what we mean when we say OT security practice. Accenture does more than just this sort of initial assessment phase, although we do that as well. We want to try to support our clients throughout the full life cycle of OT security systems and their full journey across maturity, both in the sense of helping in the early stages, defining programs, strategy, governance, and the technology pieces, but also helping our clients move into deploying systems that they've selected as part of that define phase, and then helping them run and maintain those systems in perpetuity if they desire, or anywhere in between. We can begin or end at any point in the journey that a client needs us to. One of the particular things I wanted to talk about, Accenture has been a part of the OT security space for quite some time now, and it's something that we choose to invest in continuously and make collateral and work hand in hand with others to be as big a part of it as we can. An example of that is our OT Cyber Fusion Center, or OTCFC, in Houston, Texas. We have other parts of this network, the CFC network, in other parts of the world, but our OT version in Houston is meant to be a place for you to innovate, stage, and test security systems that go into your OT environment in a threat-free and consequence-free environment, right? We have real built-out running control systems from the likes of Rockwell, Emerson, Honeywell. They're all moving water around, and we're at a smaller scale, but these are real control systems with real data, real engineering workstations and HMIs, creating as true an environment as we possibly can to mock up every piece of OT security, from Active Directory integration all the way to remote access, like we're talking about here. So we build those things, we stage those things, and then, as you can see in the picture, we have a great collaborative space for us to work together to build those things out and figure out what's the best fit for each individual client. So with that, I'm going to hand back to Deepak, just talk a little bit about what OT is and kind of how we fit into it.
Yeah, and if you're ever in Houston, you should not miss this. This is really what I call it, the Legoland for OT, and seeing what you can do and the full possibilities of it. Now, let's shift gears a bit and talk through what is driving this change, right? So when you look at, everybody talks about Industry 4.0, what does it really mean? Depending upon the vertical that you're in, let's say you're a building management company, Industry 4.0 is connecting all your buildings to the cloud and seeing how you can take all that building occupancy data and driving automation to it. If you talk to oil and gas companies, it's all about how do you take all of that data that is, let's say all these sensors are performing at a certain rate, how do you figure out part failure so that you can actually do predictive maintenance? If you're talking to consumer packaged goods companies, they want to make sure that like, for example, a bottling company, they want to see that every bottle has its own barcode and every bottle can be filled with a different beverage as it passes through the production plant. All of this, what it means is you're driving a high level of digitization, which means you're connecting these things which were traditionally not connected to the internet. That is where security becomes a key aspect of it. Now, when you talk about securing the factory floor or securing any kind of production facility, it's no easy game, because you have to start thinking about what's really needed. Where are your resources? Like, a lot of times your technicians are remote. Like a lot of the companies that we work with jointly with Accenture, their experts are probably sitting somewhere else in the globe. That's where the work from anywhere agility comes into play. The giant COVID experiment has worked to a large extent for remote maintenance, where we have seen that technicians can remotely access and do things well in advance of them physically showing up. We're seeing time and again that when you digitize it, whether it's Tesla that is revolutionizing car manufacturing, whether it's Amazon that's basically having almost no humans in their warehouses, the digitalization of the factory is happening at a very accelerated pace. Now, all of these two things will lead to you thinking about cyber resilience. Everybody remembers whether it's the Colonial Pipeline one or any of the recent, I would say, cyber attacks that have happened on the manufacturing side of the house, that if you don't think about cyber resilience, it results in significant downtime. Now, everybody looks at how can we lower the cost, and that comes from the simplicity of how you can deploy these things. You can't avoid any of these compliance standards. So that's why when we talk through securing these things, we can introduce concepts like zero trust, but how does it actually work well with a framework like IEC 62443? I can tell you, my team has spent literally months pouring through the standard. You can get lost in it, but let's look at the simplistic approach of what it really the standards is about. It's ensuring people safety. It's ensuring operational continuity. How do you achieve this? Depending upon the vertical that you're in, it looks at a specific risk assessment. How do you secure it by design? It's not about saying, if you deploy 10 firewalls here, or if you replace those VPNs with zero trust, suddenly things get better. It's really about how do you manage the risk and what's your risk appetite? It comes down to that. Talking about that, if this is the only slide you remember about IEC 62443, we've kind of done our job. Once you know where you stand, you can kind of look at this and say, which security level do you want to achieve? Obviously, you want to be at SL3 or SL4, but it comes down to risk management. I've seen companies that say, okay, we don't want to do a big assessment. We're okay with security level 1, at which point your CFO or somebody at the risk level says, okay, we're okay taking on that risk and saying 8 or 16 hours of downtime is perfectly fine by us. But that may not be possible if you're like Colonial Pipeline as an example. It could be government mandated to say you can't take more than a few minutes of unplanned downtime, at which point you need to plan for SL3 or SL4. So there's regulations, but end of the day, you will have to do some form of a self-assessment to say what's your risk appetite and how much you're willing to take. Now let's break down this IEC 62443. What does it mean? At the end of the day, this is about not letting an outside entity or even a user or whoever it is directly connect your OT environment. That's all this is about. So you have these concepts about zones, which means it's controlling that blast radius, conduits, which is really about the logical paths or the channels that you're connecting to. Cells, you can think of cells as the segmentation within the zone itself, right? So how can you segment the sensors out of the control network, out of your management network, and so on and so forth? What we are showing you here in this diagram is how does zero trust come into play? This will become more clear as Justin walks through some of the real world examples. But there's one thing that you need to remember. With zero trust, you're changing where the enforcement happens. Instead of actually doing the inspection, let's say within your DMZ, you're doing the inspection within the cloud. There are things that you would have traditionally thought about doing within your infrastructure. Now you're just doing it in the cloud. To a large extent, it's more secure. Think about it this way. Simply put, when you take the zero trust approach, you're doing an outbound only connection to the Zscaler cloud or a zero trust exchange, which means you're reducing the attack surface, which directly means to simplicity of you don't have to put that much on each of those locations to kind of start protecting, because you don't have an inbound DMZ anymore. That's kind of shifted to the cloud. So you can see you can operate within the compliance constraints of 62443, but also implement zero trust and get to that simplicity levels there. I'll show you a slightly different diagram of what this looks like. Everybody here I think, is familiar with the Purdue model. If not, I would suggest just search for Google in Google for Purdue model, and you'll get some good information regarding what that means. But you can see here that in the OT environment, the hardest challenge is changing anything level 3 or below. So we look at the zero trust implementation as there are components that you can deploy in the DMZ that establishes secure tunnels to the outside world, which is your conduits. And these deployments could either be as a Docker container, it could be either as a fully managed hardware appliance, any of those options. But the point being, it sits in the DMZ and connects to resources within level 3, which are more in the, I would say, the management side of the house. It doesn't interfere with your control side that's happening. Here's one of the real world examples that I can share, and then Justin can walk you through the full integration of how this would work. One of the largest oil services companies came to us and said, hey, we have all these oil rigs where we need two kinds of access. One is I'm bringing in third parties that will come in from unmanaged devices. The other one is I also have employees that want to make changes to the PLCs. How do we do this? Because we're operating in a shared environment in someone else's world. Luckily for us, they already had what we call as an Azure IoT gateway. Long story short, that means they have the ability to run Docker container services, using which they deployed the simple component, the zero trust component called as a reverse proxy. I won't get into the technical details of it. We'll follow through with some materials where we'll help you understand the underlying technology details. But the point being, in a zero trust environment, you're not opening up any inbound ports. You're doing reverse tunneling using the outbound ports. Now, what happens to a third party that wants to come in and say, okay, they want to log into, let's say, a PLC or RDP, SSH, or VNC? They just open up a browser. They will be first challenged with identity. And based on their identity and the policies that are applied, they will be allowed to access only those specific resources. And here's where the isolation is happening. The RDP stream itself is terminated within the Zero Trust Exchange. It's converted to a pixel. That's where the isolation is happening. All the third party is seeing is effectively like a pixelated video stream coming over HTML5. This is where the isolation happens. And that's where we can do controls about, hey, you can only do keyboard and mouse. You can't bring in files. If you want to bring in a file, it has to be checked by our anti-malware solution. Now, that may not work for certain employees, which we call as the super privileged users that want to do changes to the PLCs. That is where we would take more of an agent-based approach on a managed device where we're saying you'll check for the posture, you can do certain things. But all in all, this solution works really well for a distributed workforce that is sitting globally elsewhere, not close to that location. They're coming over satellite links. You can achieve all of these things and get closer and closer towards the 100% uptime, because you're now making sure that there's no barriers to either vendor onboarding or offboarding to get to your OT access, to go to your OT solutions. On the same token, it simplifies your segmentation as well. Now, let's skip the chase here and let's get Justin to talk through how Accenture has deployed our solution for their customers. Justin?
Thanks, Deepak. So I want to walk y'all through a case study from a client. This is a real world example of Accenture's implementation of Zero Trust Remote Access through Zscaler, as well as some other componentry related to OT security that we integrated with it. So I've got two slides for this. This conversation on here, so this slide is about setting the stage and understanding why we were doing what we're doing, and then kind of the overall idea of what the results were. The next slide is a full-blown architecture and is a little bit more technical. So as far as setting the stage, right, the client approached us with the business challenges that are on this slide. Basically, same as a lot of OT environments, they had a low level of visibility and governance over remote connections going in. The reality for almost all of our clients is that they are currently leveraging remote support in some way, shape, or form. And that goes from, a local engineer with TeamViewer on a laptop, just sort of making it happen, or, a different VPN-based solution that they struggle with to provision accounts and build things out. This client was no different. They had as well an increasing demand of those internal remote access users. So once COVID came around, as Deepak alluded to, obviously remote work became a big part of everyone's lives by necessity. And so all of a sudden they were experiencing a lot of additional folks, a lot of demand on this kind of spot solution system that they had before. And that was exacerbating the challenge. Again, same as almost all of our clients in OT, they had a pretty broad set of security gaps in their legacy OT Windows environment. We all know that when we buy a control system, we buy it to function, to perform a function. The OS that comes on that workstation or that this software supports, it's pretty immaterial. It has a real world function to do, and the OS just sort of supports it. You're probably not going to replace a control system or upgrade a control system just so you can get to Windows 11, right? So that writ large over time means that you still have Windows 7, Windows XP in some cases OSs that are not supported by modern XDR solutions, and you have to try to figure out, okay, how can I secure these things? Or if they're unmanaged Windows environments completely, you don't have a domain, you don't have WSUS or SCCM, things of that nature. Final challenge there, RDP is oftentimes not a good fit for OT security. If you have an HMI that's on the front of a panel somewhere and an operator could be using that HMI to control a process, you can't RDP into that and log them out, right? As you jump in remotely just to check a setting or make sure a screen rendered the way you wanted to and you designed it. So RDP was not an option for them in a lot of their use cases. So what did we do? Hand in hand with Zscaler and other vendors, we led a focused remote access proof of concept, evaluating a lot of different architectures and means and methods of approaching it. At the end of that, the client selected Zscaler's private access, ZPA, and privileged remote access, PRA, products as the solution they wanted to go with. So we deployed that for them. During that deployment and afterwards, we developed a very clear and concise run and maintain strategy. If by which I mean, okay, I need to add a user. What do I do? What's that workflow look like? When I add that user, how should I be managing their access? Is that something I should manage direct in a tool? Do I do it through Active Directory group? Is it a split? Who has the ability to add users? We went through that set of questions and helped define and document that for the client so that they were getting a turnkey, ready to roll system, not just an operational product that they had to kind of figure out as they went. Once we had that squared away, provided training and documentation to every OT security resource, by which I mean the direct CISO report, director of OT security, down to the electrician at the site that was now going to access a workstation remotely, and everything in between, right? Accenture is used to working at all of those levels, all the way down in the field, all the way up in the boardroom. And then once all of that was done, we continued to support that new infrastructure, both during the project, which had some other scope and went a little bit longer, and then for months afterwards, while the client built their own internal support team through hiring and moving folks around in different positions. So really kind of rounding out that full life cycle. So what did they get? What did the client get at the end of this whole thing? They have a simple remote access solution that provided them with zero trust access to OT devices without exposing them to any external network. So if you were, like Deepak talked about with the privileged remote access solution, if you're a third-party support engineer, you are watching Netflix of that control system or engineering workstation or whatever it is. You cannot directly interact with that legacy OT Windows piece of equipment that is really hard to secure and fit into a zero trust mindset in any other way. They ended up with a streamlined process for site personnel. So if you are at a site, not someone who's working centrally in a separate support team or something, site personnel can provision access to a totally new remote support person within 5 minutes. We timed it. It was important. It was a key metric, less than 5 minutes. And I'll talk about how we do that on the next slide. They got a SIM dashboard for every active remote connection, what device that connection was accessing, how long it had been going on for, and its location, all of their credentials. So again, another sort of dirty secret of the OT security industry, there are a lot of shared accounts, and there are a lot of sort of, let's say, standard operator and super user accounts. So hiding those credentials and vaulting them, even if you don't have a full-blown auto-rotating PAM solution, if your remote support engineer never sees the password, you mitigate that risk to a certain extent. Obviously, that full rotation is always the industry practice, best standard kind of thing, but the reality is sometimes we don't get there. And then as a result of all those things added together, you end up with a really strong barrier between the OT environment and ransomware. So the next slide is our architecture. I'll pause for a second, actually, in case there are any questions or Q&A. But
just a couple of things as we work through this opportunity. You could see that there's multiple elements to it. There's vendor onboarding and offboarding, the vendor not willing to deploy an agent, the fact that the OT team didn't want to file tickets to open and close accounts. So there's a whole bunch of things that are happening. So when you look at the results and outcomes as we talk through this architecture, it's important to understand that every one of them is a friction point for the OT plant operator, right? If they have to file an IT ticket to get somebody's identity established, that's minutes, hours of downtime that they will not sustain. That is why you see that in a lot of these production floor environments, the plant floor guys have deployed a modem with a 4G router because they don't want to walk through IT and security principles, right? Because that complicates the things there, right? So I would say pay attention to each of these outcomes because every one of them is extremely important. You cannot trade one for the other. Like if they were to bring in a file over, I was talking to another customer. They said, if the vendor wants to bring a file over, somebody had to make a physical copy of it, take it through one of the servers that would check for ransomware, and then somebody would physically take the USB stick. Now we completely simplified that, where somebody from an unmanaged device is uploading a file, and we are running it through ransomware checks and delivering it directly to the OT system without anybody having to make copies of it. So there's lots of such operational simplicities that helped us kind of win this account. So now I think it's good to go into the technology piece behind it.
Yeah, thanks. Deepak makes a great point. If you can't create a remote access solution that's at least on the same order of magnitude of as TeamViewer, as far as easiness and sort of seamlessness, your end client, that field engineer, is going to try to find a way to use TeamViewer or whatever, right? I'm using the term generically, but if you can't give them something that's that easy, they're going to keep trying to look for it. They'll never stop. So what we did through this architecture that I'll talk through in a second, if you're an engineer at site, you can get into, we used ServiceNow, but you could use different orchestration and sort of tie-in systems, ticketing systems. You get into a ServiceNow portal, and through a self-service web form, you can fill out a create user request. Now, as we build that web form, we have the opportunity to define, what goes in every dropdown. So when you look at those dropdowns and say, okay, I'm allowed to provision access to these vendors. And so you're gated to what email addresses you're going to send this user form to. So, you can't just send it to anyone. It only can be, Siemens, Rockwell, what have you, right? And then second dropdown, what are they going to have access to? The way that maps out, as you can see through the workflow and domain controller integration, what you're really doing is putting this new user account into an Active Directory group, and then that group's permissions are mapped to Zscaler. But when you hit that dropdown, you're defining what groups you can put them into. And so are you going to be accessing, the turbine control system, or are you only going to be accessing this compressor train or this air compression unit, whatever it is, right? You can break down machine centers, you can break it down however you define it in Active Directory. So the central security organization is able to sort of build guardrails for the site and make them an area that's, kind of safe for them to play and make choices that only affect them individually. And, no one is going to feel more responsible for their own site than the process engineer that runs that site, right? And so these are already keys that they hold in their hands. Let's make sure that they know how to drive. So giving them this space and helping them through a ServiceNow workflow was absolutely critical to creating that like sub 5-minute KPI of being able to make a new account, have someone helping them in a shorter period of time as possible. So that workflow kicks off, talks to the domain controller and Active Directory as described, but also sends an email to that third-party vendor. So that third-party support engineer, whoever they are, logs into the Zscaler portal. They don't log in to any piece of that client's infrastructure. So there's nothing that the client has to expose to the internet. There's no inbound firewall rule that they have to make broadly for you to come in and touch something. You're going straight to Zscaler's Zero Trust Exchange, their portal. As you get into that portal, you are presented with a unique dashboard for that individual based on what permissions they have. So, again, going back to the Zero Trust mindset piece, they're only seeing what it is they can touch and they're allowed to be accessing. They won't see anything else or even realize it exists. There's no network scanning. There's no exposing of your network to that third party at all. In that dashboard, they look at their phone book and click on the thing they want to pull up. The new tab pops up, and now they're looking at that Netflix screen of an RDP session to their engineering workstation. It's got their tools on it. They can make changes. They can pull values. If you so allow, they can transfer files out if they need to pull diagnostic info or values over time. They can do that through the Zscaler solution through privileged remote access. And they go on about doing their jobs. You can see in the drawing here, the Zero Trust Exchange is communicating to app connectors at your site. That is logically an inbound connection as you look and see what it is that you have. But from a traffic perspective, it's a reverse SSH tunnel. So again, you don't have to make inbound firewall rules. Everything is outbound. And it's targeted and specific. It's only going from that app connector, VM, Docker container, whatever it is, into the Zero Trust Exchange. So it's really granular and it's a very small hole outbound through your firewall. So this engineer goes on about doing their jobs. One thing that we do, right, if you're RDPing into a workstation or a Windows device, well, that's potentially a pivot point. Who's to say that in that workstation, you can't start another RDP session to something else, right? And move throughout the network in that way. What we did was pull logs into Splunk through the universal forwarder and monitor the creation of those sessions and how traffic was getting sent from each one of those workstations. Splunk knows through an integration with Zscaler what a user's access list is. And when those two things don't align, when you see a Windows log of attempting to start an RDP session to an object that is not on your access list through Zscaler, an alarm is created in Splunk, and then either if you choose to put a human in the loop, you can, or fully automated as the choice is, as you decide, you can deactivate their account and revoke their ongoing session. So you can kill their session in the moment where they're attempting that pivot and disable their account permanently. And then, you've got the forensic tracking on that. You've got session recording in the screen on that. You've got a good set of proof around why did you do that? Why did you try to pivot into this thing? And then they can explain themselves or not, as the case may be. Yeah, okay, I think we touched on pretty much all the bullets there. So just to briefly hit those again, no inbound firewall rules, no external network exposure of your more sensitive legacy OT Windows stuff to the rest of the world. We built a ServiceNow workflow to deliver that really fast user creation. And along with that, we have really fast user decreation if they color outside of the lines and try to go somewhere they're not supposed to. And I did briefly mention all of these sessions are recorded in the cloud. You have a video recording of everything that user is doing, and you can review that and go back and see whether from a training perspective to understand how they fix the problem so you don't have to call them next time, or from forensically if you're wondering, something changed, did you change it? You have the ability to see that.
And pretty soon we'll also add session control where you can usher the user in and an engineer could be looking overhead as to what's happening there. So the point being, you can see we are operating in an ecosystem where we provide the privileged remote access capabilities, but we also integrate very well with ServiceNow and Splunk and all the investments that you've already made. It's crucial to understand that in a manufacturing environment, it's very unlikely you're going to have dynamic role management. But given the fact that if you limit it down to it's just about RDP, it's not about the control stuff, you have to be very granular and very surgical about which rules can be dynamic. Because as long as it's for remote maintenance and access like this will work really well. You don't go about saying, okay, I want to limit Modbus protocols down to read only or write. There are companies that do it, but it's a lot easier to just control the management side and control the threats that come in, which is typically from your vendor side. So that's why this works really well. And I think, you have a screenshot or two about how this is actually implemented.
Oh yeah, just because sometimes it's nice to really see what it actually looks like. I just grabbed a few screenshots from our demo system for this. So top left is what the Zscaler Privileged Remote Access console looks like. You see, we have a note about an Allen Bradley engineering workstation, and that's the Windows icon means that's an RDP session. The SSH kind of caret and console is there for a switch that we've just added so that you see what that looks like in the demo. Um, Top right is what the ServiceNow workflow looks like. Again, this is just a tester. It could be whatever you needed it to be based on client, but you can see those drop downs for site name, for vendor name, and that breaks down what package you're meant to use. And one thing I didn't touch on, the way that we created this workflow, the account has a mandatory automatic deactivation date. It expires. So you can provision this access for an individual up to a week is how we set it up. You could make it longer if you chose. But if you wanted to view the ServiceNow workflow as an emergency kind of thing, you could restrict that down from a week to a day if you chose, or even an hour. You could go through and say, this is how you deliver emergency access, and we're going to make it intentionally so that it would only really work in emergency, or let's say work best in an emergency. And then in the middle there is the Splunk dashboard that we put together just to highlight the integration. Everyone's dashboard is going to end up looking a little bit different, but you can see users, policies, who's accessing things currently, what the apps are, which is what Zscaler calls the targets in that console. And again, you would customize this for how you needed it, but this is one example.
Right. With that, I think we'll jump into Q&A with questions from the audience.
Hi, we did have a few questions come in. The first one I received was, what is the typical vendor onboarding, offboarding process for most customers? What are the current challenges with the current approaches?
I think Justin touched upon a few of them, but I'll tell you the number one challenge that that customers face is vendor onboarding means you got to put them on the identity system. That means a plant operator or an engineer has to request the vendor's identity to be put into that system. That's one. It's typically the problem is offboarding. It's just like a firewall rule. Everybody creates one, almost nobody deletes it. Justin, your comments on it?
Yeah, absolutely. Right. I mean, one of the things that we advocate for, and is becoming a regulatory issue as well, you should have a separate identity store for your enterprise IT users, your normal business corporate folks, and for OT, right? Two totally separate Active Directory domains, most likely. And then you don't have to couple the OT one so tightly to HR and other enterprise systems like email or O365 access. Those hurdles don't exist in the OT space. It's a different security posture. So in some ways, right, you're looking at that and you want to be a little bit more prescriptive about deactivating accounts and removing users. And on the other hand, you know that you're not going to have to send that person a paycheck or a W-2. And so there's HR systems that you just don't need to go through, right? And so that simplifies user access quite a bit. But to Deepak's point, there are ways through other, privileged access management solutions, like CyberArk, ForgeRock, that you can pair deactivation across the two. So when you look at, if Johnny Engineer has left to a competitor, when his enterprise account is deactivated, his OT account is automatically deactivated as part of that process. And then you're timing all the vendor accounts, and you can time them pretty aggressively to expire when it's an easy thing for you to do to reactivate them, and when you don't need to involve a central function to reactivate them.
Right. I think we can spend an entire day on vendor onboarding and offboarding.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Sure. Rachel, any other questions?
Yes, we have a few more. What is the zero trust approach to solve for bidirectional connectivity for OT environments?
Again, a great question. So what we talked about today is primarily about outside in, but the same concept can be applied for inside out. I'll give you a simple example. Let's say you have an engineer that wants to use the workstation to access their personal email. In today's world, what do? They just say, okay, you can't do it, or they're issued another managed device. Our method here would be, allow that user to access the internet through browser isolation, meaning the browser is instantiated somewhere in the cloud, and all the user gets to see is the video streams. They don't get to download the files. It's the same concept applied in a reverse manner. If you have sensors that need to connect to, let's say, AWS or Azure to push the data out, we can do similar things there. The point being, when you take zero trust and try to solve for these connectivity issues, your network configuration remains almost the same. We're not trying to reconfigure that. We're kind of doing an overlay with that. Justin, from your experience, anything to add to that?
Yeah, another really common use case that fits very well is, if you're an engineer that has a question, like an automation engineer that has a question around how you might solve this particular piece of, logic or whatever, you've got a problem in code, you're curious about a feature or a setting on a controller you don't work with often, you're going to go to a lot of vendor websites, pull a lot of spec sheets, pull a lot of, deep forum level stuff, right? These places where automation engineers congregate. You can give them the ability to do those things through browser isolation without creating a security headache for yourself. We've deployed that several times, and it's been really well received by the folks on the ground, by the engineering staff. We haven't talked about it much here, and I know it's kind of a buzzword, but security as an enabler is something we really try to do twice as much, doubly hard in OT, because as you guys all well know, OT security is traditionally very resisted by folks at plants and facilities, right? Those, at the end of the day, it's change, and it's a barrier that you're intentionally building between them and some things that they're trying to do sometimes. So this browser isolation is an instance where we can show them, yes, you can do that. Let me show you how to do it securely, instead of, no, don't do that, or you can't do that anymore.
Yeah, that's one thing. And what we've seen most customers do is, because a lot of times you can't inspect device traffic outbound, you can just put a simple rule to say, let's not allow connectivity to newly created domains, because that's usually where a lot of the attack vectors come from. So briefly, a newly created domain is, Google has been there, google.com as a domain has been there for 2 decades, but anybody can go and create a newly created domain. About 60% of the internet traffic is operating on that newly created domains. If anybody remembers tiny URLs, that's considered a newly created domain. Rachel, any more questions?
Yes. Does Zero Trust OT remote access require network changes, reconfiguration at every location?
So again, remember, it's an overlay thing. So here, where we have on the diagram as a site, you can have 10 sites all with the same IP address scheme. Because Zero Trust is doing a DNS overlay of sorts, when the third-party vendor logs on, they'll get like a location dot something versus the IP address itself. That happens to be one of the biggest advantages for us. In fact, I'll go back to the oil and gas instance here. They have hundreds of oil rigs with the exact same IP address configuration. That's why they chose our solution, because it does not require any kind of network changes. As Justin, I think you have a equivalent of what you call it as a NAT.
Right. Yeah, so when you look at, when you think about what a best practice is, if you're building a newer facility, right? Like you're gonna think long and hard about segmentation and even micro segmentation, building these specific IP address ranges for whether it's machine center or package, however, like you want to try to separate those things out. But we all know that the reality of a 24/7 production environment or a continuous process, it's really challenging to find the downtime to re-IP a control system. Not to mention, it's scary, right? You don't know where all those IPs exist inside of your engineering software, inside of the code in the individual PLCs and devices. And no matter how hard you plan, you're always going to get to discover a few of them real time as you go through that process. We do that sometimes for clients, but it's a big project that takes a long time and requires a lot of planning. The ability to deliver remote access to those things without changing IP addressing is it's a godsend in the short term, to be sure.
I think we have time for 2 more questions.
Yes. What are the challenges to implementing microsegmentation in the OT environment?
I think I may have spoiled that question a little bit in the last one, right? But the downtime and manpower, planning, and effort associated with re-IPing a control system is massive, right? I mean, to be able to truly and effectively segment an OT network requires a cast of hundreds, right? We have done those projects before. It is a best practice. Like I said, it's an integral part of a defense in-depth solution. It makes everything else you're doing easier, but it is not always an option. Those are the challenges around that from a networking standpoint. There's a whole different set of challenges from an identity standpoint, right? I mean, many of these devices don't understand identity per se, especially in the legacy space. And on top of that, most of the time you're dealing with people that are using a lot of shared accounts, and it's a whole process to get those things separated out and to get those users more familiar with, running as individuals instead of just operator.
I'll give you one instance. I know, personally know a company that spent millions piloting a microsegmentation solution. It worked in the pilot for 3 months. They deployed it in production. It created some rule that stopped the production process for like about 8 hours. After that, the microsegmentation was a dead topic because at that point, it's game over. It doesn't matter how much security it brings to the table. As soon as any security solution causes unplanned downtime in the factory floor, no questions asked, it's going to get removed.
100%. We've seen much the same thing happen. And on the network side too, right? Those unplanned surprises, those can be hard to recover from sometimes. And so if you have too many of those, that project is going to become less and less popular pretty rapidly.
So we have one last question. Can you share your real-world client experience of Zero Trust transformation for OT environment? What are the learnings?
Justin, back to you.
Yeah, I mean, so the one that we did share that is a real customer experience of trying to move their remote access into a zero trust mindset. And the reality is that experiences in this space can be varied, right? I mean, we talked a little bit about some of the challenges, both Deepak and I, about kind of what happens once you experience some let's say public challenges around what happens there, but they aren't all bad by no stretch of the imagination. Are they all bad? And they get better over time. So if someone were to ask me my advice around, what's the best way to start one of these programs, or how do we do our best to ensure success and try to make smart choices, begin your projects with your simplest site. Look at low-hanging fruit in those places, get some wins, so that you begin with positive experiences, both for your user base and for your executive, leadership committees, whoever's running the purse strings behind that project, candidly, the ability to show them that things are working and that they can work and what good can look like is invaluable, because you will find a hard one. Eventually, there always is. And you have a choice to make about how much positivity you have going into that hard one.
Yeah. One thing I'll say is that at least for remote access, you can do things in parallel. You can have your existing solution as well as a zero trust work in parallel to see that the transition is pretty straightforward. So that way you're not left with, okay, if at the time of deploying a zero trust solution, something has been missed and you don't have an access solution there. Again, any topic on OT can be quite challenging, especially bringing security into play where budget dollars are hard in a low margin business, but customers are realizing that downtime is nobody's friend. And you got to tackle cybersecurity from a downtime perspective and not just from a confidentiality and integrity perspective. It's the mindset has to change more towards the last letter, which is the availability portion of it. That's where I would say, if you're an IT or security leader and you're having a conversation with the OT counterpart, do change that conversation around availability and downtime, and you'll have better success.